Have you ever wondered what a collapsing empire looks like from the inside? Not from speeches or treaties, but from the final screams of its children on the battlefield. What does it take for a nation to send 12-year-olds into combat, armed with nothing but a launcher and the words, "Protect the fatherland"? This isn't metaphor. It isn't myth. It happened, not in the first year of war, but in the very last days. In April 1945, when Berlin was already burning and the thunder of Soviet artillery could be heard across the horizon like a rolling storm that never stopped, Adolf Hitler's Third Reich faced its final stand. But instead of professional soldiers, trained divisions, or elite battalions, the final wall between the Red Army and the heart of Nazi Germany was a tattered line of old men, wounded veterans, and Hitler youth, boys still too young to shave, forced to become soldiers in a war they never started. These weren't ceremonial guards. These were frontline defenders, ordered to hold positions with little training and barely functioning weapons, as tanks rolled toward them like steel beasts from a different world. This wasn't just the end of a regime. This was the brutal, chaotic unraveling of an ideology, and its final defenders weren't SS officers in black uniforms. They were children in oversized helmets, crying for their mothers while clutching explosives. As the Soviets closed in, the city became a maze of desperation. Civilian basements turned into command posts. Sewer tunnels were used to transport ammunition. And in the middle of it all, one last order was given. One final suicidal defense of the capital. It became known as the Battle of Berlin, but within that battle was something darker, something almost too horrific to name. It was the last battle of the Third Reich, a war within a war where propaganda met pavement and every lie the regime had told came crashing down in blood and smoke. The date was April 16th, 1945. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov began the final assault on Berlin with over 2.5 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery guns. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to end it. On the other side, Hitler remained holed up in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, disconnected from the reality above ground, still issuing commands as if divisions that no longer existed could somehow appear from thin air. He believed in miracles. He believed Berlin could hold. But what he had left were Volkssturm, a militia of the elderly, the sick, and most tragically, school children. They were handed Panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank weapons, and told they would be heroes. But a Panzerfaust could only fire once, and most of them never got to reload. What kind of regime builds its foundation on terror, then ends with children screaming in alleyways while tanks crush the buildings around them? The last battle of the Third Reich wasn't a military campaign. It was a sacrifice of the nation's youth, of truth, and of any dignity the regime might have pretended to hold. In those final 10 days, as the Soviets bombarded the city from all sides, chaos ruled the streets. Nazi loyalists executed deserters. Civilians fled or hid. Hitler gave medals to teenage boys on camera, then sent them to their deaths, and the children, raised on Hitler's doctrine, trained to believe in sacrifice and destiny, went willingly. Some even cheered, others vomited from fear, but all of them were lied to. This was no defense. This was a slaughter. And as Berlin crumbled and the sky turned black with smoke, the truth of the Third Reich was finally revealed, not in speeches or symbols, but in the image of a dead child in uniform, lying beneath the ruins of a flag that promised glory and delivered only death. The first wave came like thunder, not footsteps, not shouts, just the sound of the earth itself cracking. At exactly 3 a.m. on April 16, 1945, the Soviet offensive began with a barrage so massive, so sustained, that the sky above the Silo Heights turned white with fire. For 2 straight hours, 40,000 artillery shells rained down on German positions east of Berlin, tearing trenches open, vaporizing bunkers, and stunning the last remnants of the Wehrmacht into silence. It was the kind of bombardment meant to break not just walls, but willpower. And as the Soviet troops surged forward across the Oder River, Germany's eastern defenses collapsed almost instantly. But not all of them. On the front lines, men with amputated limbs who had been recalled from hospitals clutched rifles with shaking hands. Beside them, boys no older than 14 sat in muddy foxholes, praying to gods they'd never believed in. These weren't defensive lines anymore. They were holding zones for death. By the second day, the Soviets had broken through the main defensive belt. What followed was a city-wide spiral into madness. Hitler, still in his underground fantasy, insisted that Steiner's army group, which barely existed, would launch a counterattack. In reality, entire German divisions were either surrendering, fleeing, or simply disintegrating under fire. Yet the Nazi command, locked in delusion, continued to draft teenage boys off schoolyards. Some were pulled from classrooms with geometry textbooks still open. Others volunteered, raised in a Hitler youth system that had taught them sacrifice was divine. They were handed Panzerfausts and grenades, told to aim at tanks and to never retreat. What followed was a grotesque ballet of heroism and horror. In one district, a 13-year-old named Alfred Zeck rescued wounded soldiers under sniper fire and was personally decorated by Hitler, then disappeared in the rubble 2 days later. In another, a battalion of teenage boys disabled 2 Soviet tanks and were instantly crushed by the third. Soviet war diaries speak of shock. They had expected resistance, but not children. Some soldiers hesitated. Others wept after the fighting. Because inside Berlin, the lines between soldier and victim blurred. The smell of gunpowder was constant. Machine gun nests were hidden in bedrooms. Streets were booby-trapped. Civilians walked past dead bodies like they were trash because stopping meant exposure. Nazi officers refusing surrender began executing anyone seen as weak. In one known case, a 16-year-old boy who dropped his weapon was hanged on a lamppost with a sign, "I was a coward." The city turned inward. Mothers begged commanders to spare their sons. Some shaved their boys' heads to make them appear younger, hoping Soviet soldiers would mistake them for toddlers. Others handed their children pistols and instructions. "If they come for you," one mother said to her son, "don't let them take you alive." Berlin wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a haunted graveyard where ghosts walked early. Soviet tanks rolled down boulevards that once hosted parades, now strewn with limbs and glass. Flamethrowers cleared buildings at random, and yet the defense held longer than expected, not because of strength, but because of desperation. Hitler Youth units threw Molotov cocktails from rooftops. Elderly men in SS uniforms pretended they were still officers. Doctors performed amputations by candlelight, sometimes without anesthesia. The people inside Berlin weren't just dying. They were unraveling. They knew the war was lost, but they didn't know how to stop fighting. Propaganda had turned surrender into sin. And now, with the Reich collapsing, the brainwashing became lethal. In the Tiergarten, schoolboys dug trenches. In the Reichstag, officers argued over who would die first. And in the streets, blood began to pool in the gutters. Each building taken by the Soviets cost lives. Rooms were cleared by grenades. Stairs were stacked with corpses. Snipers, some just 15 years old, fired until they ran out of bullets, then jumped from rooftops rather than be captured. Some were caught. Soviet soldiers found one boy curled in a closet, whispering "Heil Hitler" through broken teeth. He was spared, but he never spoke again. And above all this, the man responsible, Adolf Hitler, sat below ground, still fantasizing about victory. In those days, he handed out cyanide capsules like candy, to secretaries, to generals, to his dog. The end was coming, but no one would say it aloud, because to do so was to admit the truth, that everything they had built, every life lost, every child sent to die, had been for nothing, and that realization was more terrifying than death itself. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th and final birthday, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a shell, a cracked husk of crumbling stone and broken illusions. Outside, Soviet artillery lit the skyline with fire and ash. Inside, beneath 20 feet of concrete, the Führer bunker had become a psychological tomb. Those who entered rarely smiled. Those who stayed didn't sleep. Hitler himself, now pale, trembling and visibly aged, moved in jerks and mutters. His once commanding voice had thinned into angry rasps. His hands shook constantly, from either Parkinson's, amphetamine withdrawal, or fear, and yet he still believed victory was possible. That faith wasn't strategy. It was madness dressed in metals. By this point, every major city in the Reich was either flattened or overrun. German troops on the Eastern Front had no fuel, no food, no leadership. Communications were failing. Even Goebbels had stopped pretending. But inside the bunker, Hitler scribbled battle plans for ghost divisions and demanded loyalty oaths from staff who had already begun writing suicide notes. In one moment, he'd speak of negotiating peace. In the next, he'd threaten to destroy the entire nation for betraying him. Generals whispered of evacuation, but no one dared suggest it aloud. Because by then, escape was treason, and silence was survival. Above ground, Berlin's final defensive strongholds had been reduced to islands in a burning sea. The Reichstag, once the seat of democracy turned fascist spectacle, was now surrounded. Inside, German soldiers fortified stairwells with sandbags and machine gun nests. Outside, Soviet troops advanced block by block, sometimes gaining only 20 meters a day under withering fire. Snipers nested in bell towers. Boys with Panzerfausts waited behind doorways. Soviet tanks were ambushed by Molotov cocktails dropped from rooftops. The Zoo Flak Tower, a massive concrete fortress in the Tiergarten equipped with anti-aircraft guns, became a last line of resistance. It was a monstrosity, triple-layered walls, mounted guns, and thousands of civilians huddled inside its darkness. Soviet commanders considered it untouchable. No direct assault was ordered, only siege. And still, German commanders inside refused to surrender, not because they believed in the Reich's future, but because they feared what came after. Rumors of Soviet revenge had spread like wildfire. Stories of rape, executions, and torchings. Some were exaggerated, some were true, and for Berliners, hope curdled into dread. Women carried poison in their purses, families sealed basements. The Nazi elite began to vanish. Himmler secretly contacted the Allies. Göring fled south. Speer distanced himself, but Hitler refused to move. "I will die in Berlin," he declared, and that became prophecy. By April 25th, the city was fully encircled. No more reinforcements, no more orders from outside. The Reich was now a house with locked doors and fire on all sides. Every street became a trap. The subways flooded. The hospitals ran out of morphine. Wounded soldiers were given grenades to defend themselves, if overrun. And yet the orders continued. Fight, resist, do not surrender. Some obeyed. Some disobeyed and were shot. One commander, refusing to waste more lives, handed out white bedsheets for surrender and was executed by the SS an hour later. It wasn't war anymore. It was a cult in collapse, and its final prayers were made through clenched teeth and bleeding hands. Hitler's delusions reached their peak when he awarded the last Iron Crosses to Hitler Youth fighters inside the bunker garden. Teenagers stood trembling as he shook their hands. Behind them, trees burned and glass shattered. The medals meant nothing. Most of those boys were dead within 72 hours. Meanwhile, Soviet troops began finding horrors in the ruins. In the cellar of one building, they discovered the bodies of an entire family, parents and 5 children, poisoned in their sleep. In another, they found schoolboys still clutching rifles, their hands locked by rigor mortis. The Red Army wasn't prepared for this. Their victory was supposed to be liberation. Instead, it felt like walking into a grave, and yet they pushed forward. By April 28th, the Reichstag was within reach. The final battle would not be glorious. It would be brutal, room by room, floor by floor. Hitler, informed of Himmler's betrayal, screamed at walls. He ordered the execution of anyone who dared surrender. His final act of loyalty was to marry Eva Braun, his longtime companion, in a ceremony so quiet it sounded like a funeral. It was. The bunker staff began to make peace with their fate. Some drank, some wept, some made pacts. They knew the Soviets were meters away, and soon there would be no one left to fight, only victims left to be found. It ended the way it began, with silence. Not the silence of peace, but of death. On April 30th, 1945, sometime after lunch, Adolf Hitler bit down on a cyanide capsule and pulled the trigger of his pistol. Eva Braun, now his wife for less than 40 hours, did the same, minus the bullet. The sound was faint, swallowed by the concrete of the Führer bunker. No announcement, no sirens, no last rallying cry. Just a lifeless room, 2 corpses slumped on a couch, and the smell of burnt almonds from the poison. The most powerful man in Nazi Germany, who once promised a 1,000-year Reich, lasted barely 12 years, and in the final moment when every delusion collapsed, there was no crowd, no salute, no audience, just staff members dragging the bodies upstairs, soaking them in petrol and lighting the match. The wind howled through the garden. Soviet shells fell nearby. The flames flickered and the corpses burned under a gray Berlin sky. That was the end of Hitler, but not the end of the war. Incredibly, even after the dictator's death, the killing continued. Inside the bunker, Joseph Goebbels, now acting Reich Chancellor, refused surrender. He had no real authority, no army, no state, but he still believed in legacy. That night, he and his wife Magda drugged their 6 children with morphine and cyanide, one by one, in a dark underground room. The youngest was 5. Then, they walked outside and shot themselves. Their bodies were burned like Hitler's. Above ground, the Soviets didn't know Hitler was dead. Yet, the battle still raged. On May 1st, the Red Army launched its final assault on the Reichstag, believing it to be the symbolic heart of the Nazi regime. The building was gutted, hollowed by earlier bombings, but still heavily defended. German SS troops, mixed with remaining Volkssturm and Hitler Youth, held the upper floors with machine guns and grenade traps. It was a last stand, not for victory, but for spectacle. For 48 hours, Soviets fought room by room, clearing stairwells with flamethrowers, blasting hallways with explosives, and advancing by inches. The walls were black with soot. Smoke hung in the air like fog, and on the rooftop, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag. Not once, but multiple times, as sniper fire kept forcing them back. The final photo would become iconic, but in reality, the fight didn't end with that image. Inside, resistance held on for hours. Even as Hitler's corpse burned in the garden below, even as his generals surrendered or killed themselves, even as the city lay in ruins and the people begged for it to stop. What held them there? Fear? Loyalty? Or was it simply momentum? The refusal to stop marching because no one knew how to stand still anymore. Across Berlin, similar scenes played out. German soldiers, unaware their leader was gone, continued to fight in isolated pockets. Others, who knew the truth, fought anyway, convinced they'd be tortured if they surrendered. In one district, a Soviet tank was destroyed by a 12-year-old boy with a Panzerfaust. In another, a 70-year-old man was found manning a machine gun until he collapsed from exhaustion. These weren't acts of heroism. They were the final echoes of brainwashing, a war machine still spinning even after its engine had exploded. And yet, some began to crack. On May 2nd, General Helmuth Weidling, the last military commander of Berlin, gave the order to surrender the city. The signal was faint. Scattered units didn't receive it. Some refused to believe it. Others laid down arms in disbelief. Soviet soldiers entered what was left of command posts and found officers sitting in silence, some drunk, some crying, some already dead by their own hand. There were no more plans, no more illusions, just smoldering ruins, unburied corpses, and the sickening knowledge that everything was lost. Children emerged from basements, eyes wide, ears ringing from days of shelling. Civilians wandered the streets like ghosts, stepping over bodies in striped pajamas and broken helmets. The smell of rot and gunpowder was everywhere. The war was over in Berlin, but no one knew what peace looked like anymore. And beneath the rubble, in every collapsed building and shattered dream, lay the truth that could never be erased. The final defenders of Hitler's Reich were not warriors, but boys. Boys who believed. Boys who obeyed. Boys who died for a lie. The first day without fighting didn't feel like victory. It felt like the world had stopped breathing. On the morning of May 3rd, 1945, Berlin surrendered in more than just paperwork. The guns fell silent. The smoke began to thin, and for the first time in weeks, there was no shelling, no screaming, no orders barked through rubble-strewn streets. But silence in a city like Berlin, after what had just happened, was not peace. It was the heavy quiet that comes after something breaks. Soviet troops, now fully in control of the capital, moved through the ruins with caution and awe. The streets they entered no longer looked like streets. Trees had been shredded into splinters, buildings were cracked open like skulls, statues were headless, fountains choked with ash. In many places, sidewalks were slick with blood and oil, indistinguishable. Some soldiers cried. Others snapped photos. Most were too stunned to speak. They passed corpses that had been lying in the sun for days. Civilians, soldiers, even animals from the Berlin Zoo that had escaped and died confused in alleyways. The stench was unimaginable. The air itself was wounded. And among all this emerged the survivors, pale, trembling, starved civilians who stumbled out of cellars like ghosts crawling from a grave. Some fell to their knees in front of Soviet soldiers, hands raised. Others stood frozen, children clinging to their sides, unsure if this was rescue or the beginning of something worse. The Red Army, exhausted and brutalized from years of war, didn't always act with mercy. Looting was rampant, so were assaults. Some Soviet officers tried to maintain order, but vengeance had fermented for too long. Entire apartment blocks were emptied. Women painted themselves with soot to appear older. Young girls were hidden in closets and chimneys. It wasn't liberation, it was aftermath. In one building, Soviet soldiers found a group of Hitler Youth survivors, boys no older than 16, sitting around a candlelit table too traumatized to speak. They had defended a government that was now a smoldering memory. Some still wore armbands, others had discarded their uniforms but clutched them like blankets. One boy had written a goodbye letter to his mother and was surprised to still be alive. These children, once paraded as symbols of Germany's future, were now staring at a future they couldn't comprehend. In the flak tower, hundreds of civilians waited for someone to tell them it was safe. For days they had lived in the dark, beneath layers of concrete, surrounded by the thunder of artillery. When the Soviets finally breached the entrance, they didn't cheer. They panicked. Was this the end or another battle? Some prayed, some screamed, some offered watches, rings, anything to be spared. But the soldiers had already seen too much. They weren't looking for enemies anymore. Just food, shelter, rest. And maybe, in the eyes of these civilians, some reflection of the humanity they had lost on the long road from Stalingrad to Berlin. Outside, the city began to rot. Thousands of bodies still lay unburied. Fires smoldered in the basements of collapsed buildings. The hospitals, overwhelmed and understaffed, could do little but offer aspirin and hope. There were no victory parades, no music, just the grim task of cleaning up a world that had collapsed on itself. Mass graves were dug by hand. Civilians were forced to pile corpses. The Red Cross arrived days later, too late for most. And throughout it all, the question hung in the air like smoke. Why had it gone this far? Why had children been given guns? Why had the regime refused surrender until every stone had bled? The answers, of course, were tangled in years of lies and power. But for those who had survived, especially the Hitler Youth, the emotional fallout was unbearable. Many refused to speak of it for decades. Some never did. They carried guilt, not for what they had done, but for what they had believed, for how easy it had been to trust a man on a balcony, shouting promises of greatness, while their fathers vanished into war and their cities turned to ash. In post-war therapy sessions, rare and controversial, former Hitler Youth members described dreams of fire, of orders they couldn't refuse, of friends who exploded in front of them. They had wanted to be heroes. Instead, they had become witnesses, and that haunted them more than anything, because unlike adult soldiers, they had no framework for understanding it. They were taught obedience, not morality, loyalty, not choice, and now they lived in a world where everything they'd been taught was burned down with the Reichstag. As for the city itself, Berlin would be split in two, its ruins carved up like spoils. But in those first days after the fall, it was just a wasteland, a capital of shadows. Every brick told a story. Every child's face asked a question no one could answer. The last battle of the Third Reich wasn't marked by a final victory or a clear defeat. It was marked by absence of truth, of leaders, of meaning. And in that absence, the silence grew louder. It seeped into the walls, the photographs, the school books that would later try to explain this madness. But for those who were there, who saw the boys march into machine gun fire, who held their breath as their buildings collapsed, who woke up not knowing whether the war was over or if this was just another nightmare, silence was not peace. It was punishment. And it would last for generations. The news moved slower than the war had. Days passed before the world fully understood what had happened in Berlin. On May 4th, Allied radios crackled with broken confirmations. Hitler is dead. Berlin has fallen. The Reich is no more. But for most listeners, soldiers in trenches, families at kitchen tables, survivors in hospital beds, the news didn't bring celebration. It brought silence, a stunned, aching silence that mirrored the ghost town stillness of the German capital itself. For years, the name Hitler had meant power, terror, war, and now he had vanished into fire and ash, leaving behind nothing but a cratered city, millions of corpses, and boys too young to understand what they'd just survived. In New York, London, Paris, bells rang. Flags were raised, crowds gathered in half-formed celebration, but the joy felt incomplete. Something wasn't right. The war wasn't over. Not entirely. Japan still held out, and Europe's scars were too fresh to dance in the streets. Meanwhile, in Russia, news of victory in Berlin sparked a different reaction, one of quiet exhaustion. Soviet soldiers who had stormed the Reichstag didn't cheer when the flag was raised. Many cried, some collapsed, others stared at the sky and whispered names of mothers, brothers, comrades buried from Leningrad to Kursk. They had seen too much, and though their boots now stood in Hitler's capital, there was no glory in it, only a haunted sense of completion, a job finished, but not a soul healed. Soviet medics reported dozens of cases of battlefield trauma in the days following Berlin's fall. Men who had held it together for years suddenly broke down. Some wept uncontrollably, others became violent. One commander shot himself after writing, "I survived the Reich, but not what it did to me." These were not soldiers returning from victory. They were shells, emptied out by fire, guilt, and the weight of what they had seen, especially in Berlin. The charred corpses, the children with rifles, the mothers who poisoned their babies rather than surrender, the women who smeared themselves in feces hoping to avoid rape. These images did not vanish when the war ended. They followed the men home, into marriages, jobs, silence. The Soviet Union did not give its soldiers therapy. It gave them medals and the expectation to forget. But forgetting Berlin was impossible. It was the grave of a continent's sanity, and no one who entered its ruins walked out whole. Across Germany, as the Third Reich disintegrated, the world turned its gaze to the youth who had defended it, the Hitler Jugend. These were not just child soldiers, they were ideological clay, raised from kindergarten to believe in blood, pride, and destiny. By 1945, many had known nothing but war. Some had never seen a Jew in real life, but had been taught to hate them. Others believed Hitler was a god, and Germany's collapse was the work of traitors and demons. Now, standing in the rubble, their world gone, they were asked to reintegrate, to become civilians again. But how does a child unlearn hate that had been fed to him like breakfast? How does a teenager return to school when he last held a flamethrower? Some Hitler youth were arrested and interrogated. Others were sent to re-education camps run by Allied forces. American and British officers showed them films of concentration camps, of emaciated survivors, piles of shoes, gas chambers. The footage was intended to shock them out of denial, and in many cases it did. Boys vomited, some fainted. One reportedly clawed his face open, screaming, "They lied to us." But others refused to believe it. They said the films were fake, propaganda. They clung to the lies because the truth meant their friends had died for nothing. The psychological damage was generational. Studies decades later found elevated PTSD, depression, and moral injury among former Hitler youth, especially those who had fought in Berlin. Many never married. Many became alcoholics. Some spent their lives trying to atone, volunteering in Holocaust memorials, or publishing memoirs that read like confessions. One survivor wrote, "I was 13 when I was handed a rifle and told to die for Germany. I did not die, but I stopped living that day." The Allies, for their part, didn't know what to do with these children. They couldn't be tried like adults, but they weren't innocent. They had pulled triggers, thrown grenades, killed men, and yet they were also victims of propaganda, of fear, of a government that had turned childhood into a weapon. So most were quietly released, given food, paper, names to write to. Some found their families, others never did. They drifted between countries, between identities. For a time, to be a former Hitler youth was to carry a stain that one could wash off, and the rest of the world looked away, not out of cruelty, but confusion. How do you punish a child for doing what he was trained to do? How do you rebuild a world that asked boys to die for myths? These were questions no victory parade could answer. These were wounds no treaty could heal. In the halls of power, The end of the Third Reich was discussed in maps and documents, but in the streets of Berlin, among the survivors, the orphans, the quiet wreckage of what had once been a capital, the truth was harder to speak, because it wasn't just a government that had collapsed, it was a mirror, one that showed how quickly civilization can be replaced with fanaticism, how easily a child can be made into a killer, and how even in death, lies can linger like smoke in the lungs of those who breathed them in too deeply, for too long. Berlin was dead, but the war wasn't. For days after Hitler's body was burned and the red flag flew over the Reichstag, the illusion of a living Third Reich lingered in strange places, in the radio broadcasts from Flensburg, in scattered garrisons still firing at Allied tanks, in mountain strongholds deep in the Bavarian Alps where whispers of a national redoubt refused to die. It was called the Alpine Fortress, a supposed last bastion of Nazi power nestled in the rugged terrain of southern Germany and western Austria. According to German propaganda, high-ranking SS officers and loyal troops had stockpiled weapons, food, and ammunition in underground bunkers, preparing for a final stand that would make the Allies bleed for every peak and pass. Some believed Hitler had gone there. Others claimed the Luftwaffe had secret airstrips carved into the cliffs. Maps were drawn. Bombers were dispatched. American intelligence feared a fanatical resistance movement rising from the mountains, one that could drag the war out for months or even years. But when Allied forces reached the region in early May, they found no fortress, no army, just scattered troops, dazed and starving, hiding among villages. The Alpine Fortress was a ghost, a myth that had become so powerful, even its creators had started to believe it. And yet, even without a redoubt, the killing didn't stop. In Czechoslovakia, SS divisions were still fighting, days after Hitler's death. On May 6th, in the small town of Milin, German soldiers opened fire on Czech resistance fighters and Red Army troops in what would become the last large-scale battle in Europe. It was chaotic, brutal, and utterly pointless. More than 200 people died in the span of 48 hours, all while Germany's high command was already in talks for surrender. In Denmark, Nazi officials refused to step down. In Norway, over 300,000 German troops still held positions, unwilling to surrender until they received orders from someone, anyone. Some genuinely didn't know Berlin had fallen. Others knew, but chose not to believe it. The collapse of the Third Reich was so sudden, so absolute, that it created a psychological vacuum. For men who had sworn loyalty to Hitler, who had been trained to view defeat as betrayal, the idea that it was over felt like heresy. Some deserted. Some committed suicide. Some clung to command posts and told themselves reinforcements would come. In isolated Alpine villages, German officers held surreal meetings, discussing non-existent troop movements, planning counterattacks on maps that no longer mattered. One commander reportedly gave a speech on May 7th about holding the line until Führer returns. He was later found alone in his quarters, surrounded by empty food cans and a pistol. Meanwhile, in France and Belgium, scattered skirmishes flared up as German rearguards tried to fight their way east. Not for victory, but for escape. No one wanted to be captured by the Soviets. Surrendering to the Americans or British offered a sliver of mercy. But in the East, it was vengeance. Word had spread about what the Red Army had seen at Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, and the Germans knew what that meant. In Austria, an SS unit attempted to hold a bridge against US tanks for 2 days, not because they had orders, but because they feared retribution. They had executed prisoners weeks earlier. Now they waited for ghosts. The Americans buried them in shallow graves by the roadside. Elsewhere, Small bands of fanatics refused to believe any of it. In Bavaria, a Nazi youth leader barricaded a school and declared it a sovereign German state. He had 30 boys under his command, all armed, all malnourished. They held out for 3 days until American tanks rolled through the gates. No shots were fired. The boys dropped their weapons and cried. In another town, a German radio technician continued broadcasting pro-Hitler messages well into May, convinced the capital was under siege but still resisting. When Allied troops arrived, they found him sitting in a wrecked studio, speaking into a dead microphone, surrounded by empty beer bottles. He hadn't left in 9 days. These were not isolated incidents. They were fragments of a shattered identity. The last, flickering embers of a regime that had devoured its own soul. For 12 years, the Third Reich had been a religion. Now its God was dead, and its priests were either gone or mad. And yet the war refused to truly end, not just because of geography or logistics, but because of belief. People don't stop believing overnight, even when the city falls, even when the leader is ash, even when the streets are silent and the children have buried their fathers. Some beliefs linger like smoke inside a ruined cathedral. In Germany's mountains, forests, and border towns, the belief that the Reich could rise again haunted the final days. Surrender papers were being signed, but the dying hadn't stopped, and for the men on the ground, the last ones to shoot, to run, to bleed, the end felt less like peace and more like vanishing. Their world had collapsed, but no one told them how to live in the ruins, and so they clung to the only thing left, the motion of war itself. Peace came first on paper, and then only reluctantly in reality. On May 7th, 1945, inside a nondescript school building in Reims, France, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. It should have been the moment the world exhaled, the end of a nightmare, but the room was quiet, tense, almost awkward. Representing the crumbling German high command was General Alfred Jodl, his eyes sunken, cheeks pale, fingers twitching as he signed the instrument of surrender. Around him stood Allied commanders from the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, but the mood wasn't triumph. It was fatigue, suspicion. Everyone knew this war wasn't ending with a handshake. It was limping towards silence with too much left unsaid. The document stated that all German forces would cease hostilities at 23:01 Central European Time on May 8th. But even before the ink dried, problems began. Stalin, furious that the surrender had been signed in the West, and not on German soil and not before his own generals, refused to recognize it as final. To him, it was a diplomatic insult, a Western attempt to claim victory that Soviet blood had purchased. So he demanded a second ceremony, a real one, in Berlin, the heart of the fallen Reich. That meant the war had to end twice. So just after midnight on May 9th Moscow time, still May 8th in most of Europe, another surrender was staged in Karlshorst, a suburb of destroyed Berlin. This time, German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the documents under the cold stare of Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Photographers captured the moment, Keitel hesitating with his pen, Zhukov standing stone-faced, a war's worth of fire burning behind his eyes. No one spoke much, no one smiled. It was an execution, not a celebration. Stalin got his moment. The West got theirs. But the soldiers, the millions still scattered across Europe, got confusion, because while leaders signed papers and shook hands, the killing didn't stop instantly. In many regions, the ceasefire order took hours or days to arrive. In some pockets, German officers ignored it altogether. In Czechoslovakia, heavy fighting continued through May 11th. In Norway, troops surrendered only after Allied ships arrived to collect them. Across the Eastern Front, Soviet units continued advancing into German territory, encountering resistance that technically shouldn't have existed. Prisoners were still being taken. Camps were still being discovered. Mines were still exploding. The war had ended, but it didn't feel over. In London, crowds gathered in Trafalgar Square on May 8th. Churchill spoke to a sea of faces, his voice hoarse but defiant. "This is your victory," he said, but his smile faded quickly. Even in victory, the price had been too high. In Paris, the Eiffel Tower glowed again, but many Parisians stayed home. Too many empty chairs at too many tables. In New York, Times Square erupted in joy, but for families who had lost sons in the final weeks, in battles that perhaps didn't need to happen, there was no cheering, just photographs and folded flags. And in Germany, peace didn't bring freedom. It brought reckoning. Allied forces moved swiftly to arrest surviving Nazi officials. War criminals were rounded up, interrogated, and shipped off for trial. The Nuremberg trials were still months away, but already the machinery of justice, or what passed for it, was turning. In villages and cities across Germany, civilians were forced to walk through concentration camps to see what had been done in their name. Footage of these processions was broadcast globally, women crying, men vomiting, children asking questions no adult could answer. The world wanted accountability, but it also wanted simplicity, a clean ending, a victory with a bow on top. What it got was far messier, because war doesn't end when the paper says so. It ends when the minds and hearts of those who fought can stop reliving it, and that would take decades, if it ever happened at all. The final days of the Third Reich were not just military, they were psychological. Millions of Germans woke up on May 9th, no longer citizens of a country. The Reich was gone. The Führer was dead. Have you ever wondered what a collapsing empire looks like from the inside, not from speeches or treaties, but from the final screams of its children on the battlefield? What does it take for a nation to send 12-year-olds into combat, armed with nothing but a launcher and the words, "Protect the fatherland"? This isn't metaphor. It isn't myth. It happened, not in the first year of war, but in the very last days. In April 1945, when Berlin was already burning, and the thunder of Soviet artillery could be heard across the horizon like a rolling storm that never stopped, Adolf Hitler's Third Reich faced its final stand. But instead of professional soldiers, trained divisions, or elite battalions, the final wall between the Red Army and the heart of Nazi Germany was a tattered line of old men, wounded veterans, and Hitler youth, boys still too young to shave, forced to become soldiers in a war they never started. These weren't ceremonial guards. These were frontline defenders, ordered to hold positions with little training and barely functioning weapons, as tanks rolled toward them like steel beasts from a different world. This wasn't just the end of a regime. This was the brutal, chaotic unraveling of an ideology, and its final defenders weren't SS officers in black uniforms. They were children in oversized helmets crying for their mothers while clutching explosives. As the Soviets closed in, the city became a maze of desperation. Civilian basements turned into command posts. Sewer tunnels were used to transport ammunition. And, in the middle of it all, one last order was given. One final suicidal defense of the capital. It became known as the Battle of Berlin, but within that battle was something darker, something almost too horrific to name. It was the last battle of the Third Reich, a war within a war, where propaganda met pavement, and every lie the regime had told came crashing down in blood and smoke. The date was April 16th, 1945. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov began the final assault on Berlin with over 2.5 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery guns. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to end it. On the other side, Hitler remained holed up in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, disconnected from the reality above ground. still issuing commands as if divisions that no longer existed could somehow appear from thin air. He believed in miracles. He believed Berlin could hold, but what he had left were Volkssturm, a militia of the elderly, the sick, and most tragically, schoolchildren. They were handed Panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank weapons, and told they would be heroes. But a Panzerfaust could only fire once, and most of them never got to reload. What kind of regime builds its foundation on terror, then ends with children screaming in alleyways while tanks crush the buildings around them? The last battle of the Third Reich wasn't a military campaign. It was a sacrifice of the nation's youth, of truth, and of any dignity the regime might have pretended to hold. In those final 10 days, as the Soviets bombarded the city from all sides, chaos ruled the streets. Nazi loyalists executed deserters. Civilians fled or hid. Hitler gave medals to teenage boys on camera, then sent them to their deaths. And the children, raised on Hitler's doctrine, trained to believe in sacrifice and destiny, went willingly. Some even cheered. Others vomited from fear. But all of them were lied to. This was no defense. This was a slaughter. And as Berlin crumbled and the sky turned black with smoke, the truth of the Third Reich was finally revealed, not in speeches or symbols, but in the image of a dead child in uniform, lying beneath the ruins of a flag that promised glory and delivered only death. May 9th, no longer citizens of a country. The Reich was gone. The Führer was dead. The promises of greatness had collapsed into ash and tribunal summons. For the young, especially those raised under Hitler's regime, the cognitive dissonance was unbearable. How could everything they were taught be lies? How could their sacrifices, their losses, their dead fathers, all have been for nothing? In schools, Nazi textbooks were burned, swastikas torn down, propaganda films locked away or destroyed. But the minds they had shaped couldn't be erased so easily. In many towns, people refused to believe the Holocaust had happened, even when shown the evidence. Others broke entirely. Suicide rates spiked. Families turned inward, ashamed, afraid. Former SS officers changed names, fled to the countryside, or vanished into South America. And as the world moved forward, Germany stood still, a nation without identity, without trust, trying to survive the guilt that peace had delivered. Meanwhile, in the East, Soviet soldiers marched home, hailed as heroes, but carrying horrors no one wanted to hear. Their medals glittered. Their eyes did not. The Red Army had saved the world from fascism, but it had also witnessed the depths of it, and sometimes mirrored it. That contradiction haunted veterans for life. Peace may have come to Europe, but it came unevenly, awkwardly, like a ceasefire between two wounded animals, unsure whether to collapse or bite. For some, VE Day was the greatest moment in modern history. For others, it was just the end of noise, the beginning of silence. And in that silence, ghosts began to whisper. In bombed-out cathedrals, in abandoned bunkers, in the minds of children who had once worn uniforms too big for their bodies and saluted a future that had burned before it could arrive. The guns had stopped, but the silence was not peace. It was something colder. Berlin, once the pride of the Reich, was now a carcass divided by victors. 4 flags flew where one had reigned: American, British, French, and Soviet, each staked into their own quadrant of what remained of the capital. The division wasn't just political, it was physical, emotional, psychic. Entire neighborhoods lay flattened, their stone facades caved in by shells and scorched by bombs. Streets where symphonies once echoed now smelled of ash and ammonia. The air was too quiet, the ground too soft from mass graves hastily filled. Soviet soldiers patrolled the eastern half like conquering ghosts, their boots clapping over cracked cobblestone, their rifles slung low, their eyes scanning for threats that no longer breathed. In the West, American and British troops tried to enforce order, but they didn't speak the language, and they didn't understand the silence that greeted them from apartment windows. The people of Berlin didn't wave flags. They didn't cry in joy. They just stood still, waiting to see what the end of the world meant the morning after. Germany was no longer a country. It was a cautionary tale divided into 4 zones, stitched together with suspicion and barbed wire. Denazification began with feverish urgency. Street signs were stripped, statues torn down, books burned again, this time not by fascists, but by those trying to erase them. Teachers were dismissed, judges interrogated, children tested for loyalty. The Third Reich's corpse was being dissected in public, and no one could look away. But while some parts of the nation submitted quietly, others resisted. In small towns, whispers of a future Fourth Reich passed through underground circles. Former SS men shaved their heads, changed their names, and re-entered civilian life as mechanics, mayors, mailmen. Some were caught, most weren't. And in the East, where the Red Army's grip was strongest, punishment took a different form. Soviet occupation was not a surgical removal of Nazism. It was retribution. Farms were stripped, factories dismantled and shipped to Moscow. Women were raped in numbers too high for the West to report without scandal. The Western allies watched, horrified and helpless. This wasn't the victory they had imagined. This was a transfer of darkness, not its eradication. In Berlin, hunger became the new war. With infrastructure collapsed, food supplies rationed, and thousands of refugees pouring into the city every day, starvation set in faster than ideology could be cleansed. Children fought over rotten potatoes. Old men collapsed while standing in line for bread. Mothers sold wedding rings for soup bones. The once proud German capital had been reduced to a scavenger's kingdom, ruled by ruins, fed by black markets, and haunted by the memory of what it had cheered just months before. And yet, beneath the rubble, the future was stirring. In 1946, lines were drawn not just on maps, but in minds. The Americans and British began helping West Berlin rebuild, not out of pity, but strategy. A strong West Germany, they reasoned, would be a buffer against the Soviets. Stalin, seeing the same pattern, tightened his grip on the East. Communication lines were severed. Propaganda filled the air. Suddenly, the last battle of the Third Reich became the first maneuver of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain hadn't fallen yet, but you could hear its hinges groaning. In this atmosphere, Berlin became a paradox, a city that had lost everything, yet became the symbol of the next great global standoff. American planes dropped candy to children during the Berlin airlift. Soviet tanks rumbled through the east like ancient predators. Everyone claimed to be rebuilding, but they were really rearming. And the people caught between it all, the mothers, the orphans, the wounded soldiers with no country left, simply tried to survive. They dug gardens in bomb craters, held weddings in ruined churches, played Beethoven on pianos missing keys. Peace wasn't a celebration. It was an adaptation, a redefinition of normal, because for them, the war wasn't over. Not really. It had just shifted shape. It was no longer boys sent to die at the front. It was boys growing up in shadows, waiting to be conscripted into ideologies that hadn't died, only rebranded. Teachers warned against communism in the West. Priests warned against decadence in the East. And all the while, the ghosts of Hitler's last war wandered through basements and schoolyards, muttering about glory, betrayal, and futures lost in flame. The division of Germany wasn't clean. It was jagged, a wound that would scab but never heal. In the years to come, Walls would rise, spies would crawl through sewers, and nuclear. Missiles would be aimed at children who had already survived one apocalypse, but in 1945, all of that was still unspoken. The people of Berlin didn't know yet what kind of pawn they were becoming. They just knew the war was over. And yet, everything still felt like war. The uniforms had changed. The language of fear had changed. But the silence, the way it pressed against the chest like guilt soaked into bone, that remained. And so did the ruins. The Reichstag still stood, barely, its dome blasted open like a broken skull. Some wanted to tear it down. Others said, let it rot, a monument to failure. Few spoke aloud the deeper truth, that the Third Reich had not just destroyed the world, it had destroyed Germany itself, and now the survivors, both innocent and complicit, would have to figure out how to live in a country whose name no one wanted to say. They were called the future of the Reich, but by the time the smoke cleared, they were just children in oversized uniforms, shivering in basements, afraid to speak. The Hitler Youth, once the pride of a militarized society, paraded through the streets in tidy columns, arms raised and eyes shining, were now scattered, stunned, and silent. No one wanted to talk about them. No one knew what to do with them. They had been told they were Germany's last hope, its sword and shield. They had marched, chanted, drilled, and trained for a victory they were promised was inevitable. And then, without warning, the world they were built for collapsed. In the weeks after the Third Reich's fall, Allied soldiers and officials encountered thousands of Hitler Youth members, some as young as 9, others barely old enough to shave, wandering through the ruins of Berlin, trying to find their parents, their units, or any trace of meaning. Many had no homes to return to. Others had families who refused to speak of the uniforms they wore. Some were orphaned not by bombs, but by ideology. Their parents had died for a lie, and now the children were expected to live with its consequences. In the Soviet zone, the treatment was harsh. Hitler Youth boys were often rounded up, interrogated, and in some cases imprisoned. To the Red Army, they were not victims. They were soldiers, enemy combatants. Even when they cried, even when they begged. In the Western zones, the approach was more conflicted. American and British officers knew these boys had been indoctrinated, not enlisted. But the damage was real. In some cases, Allied units sent psychologists to assess their mental state. What they found was chilling. Most of the boys didn't even know what they believed anymore. They had been taught that Hitler was a father, a savior, a god, that Jews were vermin, that dying for the Führer was the highest honor. And now, in the ruins, they whispered the same things, not out of loyalty, but because they had nothing else to hold on to. They had no language for the shame, so they clung to certainty. We were told we were the best, one survivor would later recall. Then they said we were criminals. So what are we? That question echoed through classrooms, orphanages, and therapy rooms for years. Post-war Germany wanted to move on, to rebuild, to forget. But how do you forget a generation raised for war? The Hitler Youth program had been more than military drills. It had been identity engineering. From the age of 10, boys and girls were separated, taught different roles. Boys were molded into warriors. Girls were trained to bear children for the Reich. Every song, every badge, every camping trip was part of a vast psychological operation, and it had worked too well. In 1945, the boys who had survived were not just children, they were ruins, like the city around them. Their minds had been shelled, their futures mined. And yet, the world didn't know how to mourn them, or forgive them, or help them, so most were left to rot in silence. Many suffered from what we now call complex PTSD, though at the time, no one had the words. Nightmares, violent outbursts, self-harm, emotional numbness. Some grew up unable to form relationships. Others became addicts, criminals, or suicides. A few, terrifyingly, never gave up the dream. In the 1950s, small neo-Nazi cells quietly emerged in West Germany, many founded by former Hitler youth who still wore the armbands in private. They held reunions, swapped photographs, kept the slogans alive, but most simply faded, their trauma unspoken, their memories locked in drawers like old medals. In East Germany, under Soviet control, the state imposed a harsh kind of re-education. Hitler youth members were forced to attend ideological training sessions, recite communist doctrine, and denounce their past. Publicly, they complied. Privately, they folded in on themselves. They were not allowed to grieve, not allowed to ask, only to erase. But history doesn't erase that easily. In family photo albums across Germany, pictures of boys in brown shirts stood beside Christmas trees and birthday cakes. No one knew what to say about them, so the albums were hidden, in basements, in attics, in silence. Schools rarely taught what the Hitler Youth had really been. Teachers were afraid, parents were ashamed, and the boys, now men, walked the streets of post-war Germany with a kind of haunted stiffness, as if afraid their boots still echoed too loudly. Some tried to speak. Memoirs began to trickle out in the 1970s and 80s, brutal, heartbreaking confessions from men who had been 10 or 12 when the world handed them rifles and told them they were saviors. One recalled being awarded an Iron Cross for blowing up a Soviet tank with a Panzerfaust at age 14. Another described the moment he realized the enemy soldiers he was shooting at were just boys too, only hungrier, only more afraid. These accounts shocked the world, not because they were evil, but because they were human. And that's what made them unbearable. We want villains to be monsters, but these were children, trained to be monsters, lied to by their schools, their radio stations, their neighbors. And when the truth came, it wasn't liberating. It was crushing. They hadn't just lost a war. They had lost their childhood and had nothing to replace it with. No country, no purpose, no innocence, just silence and guilt and the unrelenting question, what was I? Today, the last survivors of the Hitler Youth are dying off. Most never spoke about it publicly. Some did in trembling voices on grainy black and white documentaries, their faces pale and eyes cloudy. They don't ask for forgiveness. Many say they don't deserve it, but they do ask to be remembered, not as Nazis, not as heroes, but as evidence. Evidence of what happens when a state poisons its children with ideology and calls it honor. When war isn't a battlefield, it's a schoolroom, a summer camp, a bedtime story. The Hitler Youth didn't die with Hitler. It died slowly, in hospitals, in jail cells, in empty apartments where old men sat alone with medals they couldn't throw away. And in that death, we are reminded that the last battle of the Third Reich wasn't just fought with tanks and bombs. It was fought in minds too young to know they'd been drafted. They had marched beside the men, not always in uniform, not always with rifles, but always with presence. The women of the Third Reich were everywhere, even if history chose not to see them. In the propaganda posters, they smiled in wheat fields and nurseries, cradling the future of the Aryan race. In reality, they stood in munitions factories, typed orders for deportation, handed out blankets at train stations, and in some cases, held whips in their hands behind the barbed wire of concentration camps. When the Reich collapsed, it wasn't just the men who vanished into smoke and suicide. It was also the women who had kept the machine running in silence, out of love, fear, ignorance, or belief, and no one quite knew what to do with them. In the first days of occupation, Allied soldiers found women everywhere, mourning in doorways, hiding in bomb shelters, scavenging for children, or weeping for husbands who were either dead or missing. Some were defiant, others were broken, but beneath their coats and scarves, many wore a secret uniform, not one stitched from wool, but from complicity. They had supported the war, voted when allowed, donated gold for the fatherland, enrolled their sons in the Hitler Youth. Some had sent their Jewish neighbors away with baskets of food, then moved into their apartments 2 days later. After the war, shame came differently for them. It wasn't always about trials or prison. Sometimes it was just silence, isolation, a refusal to speak their names in public. They weren't seen as victims nor as villains. They were gray, and history has never known how to write about gray. But some were more than gray. Some were black. The female guards of the concentration camps, the Aufseherinnen, were among the most feared figures in the Nazi terror apparatus. At Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen, they barked orders, wielded sticks, beat prisoners, and in many cases, selected women and children for death. When the war ended, a number of these women were captured and tried. Irma Gracie, known as the Beautiful Beast, was executed at age 22 for her cruelty. Other names, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Johanna Bormann, faded into the records of post-war justice, but many others simply disappeared into the ruins, changed their names, took jobs as secretaries, nurses, mothers. The West wanted to rebuild. The Soviets wanted to dominate. Neither had time for exhaustive trials, so most of the women who had aided the Reich, whether in camps, offices, or kitchens, were never held accountable. They just melted back into society. And yet, punishment still came, not always from courts, often from neighbors. In the streets of Berlin and Hamburg and Munich, women who had relationships with Nazi officers, or worse, with Allied soldiers after the war, were publicly humiliated. Their heads were shaved, their faces slapped. Sometimes they were stripped and paraded through town squares as traitors to the fatherland. But it wasn't always about justice. Sometimes it was just rage looking for a target. When a regime dies, it doesn't bury itself. It asks its survivors to carry the weight. And the women? Mothers, lovers, sisters, secretaries, bore that weight in silence. Few memoirs came from them, fewer interviews. Most chose to erase their own stories. They had been used, told they were sacred vessels for Hitler's dream, told their wombs were weapons, their kitchens part of the front line, and when it all fell apart, no one handed them a narrative, so they wrote none. In Eastern Germany, under Soviet rule, women bore another kind of burden. The Red Army's invasion brought mass sexual violence, a campaign so widespread that even the Soviet government, years later, would struggle to contain the shame. Hundreds of thousands of German women were raped in the final weeks of the war. Some were killed, some became pregnant. Most were left with wounds no tribunal could measure, and yet their stories too were silenced. The world did not want to hear about German women as victims, not after what the Reich had done. There was no space for their pain, so they carried it through marriages, through childbirth, through decades of quiet. In the West, life moved on. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, transformed West Germany into a capitalist powerhouse, and the women who had lived through the war took jobs, raised children, and buried their pasts. But sometimes it surfaced in a glance, a shiver, a refusal to speak about the photo on the wall. Daughters would ask, "What did you do during the war, Mama?" And the answer was always a pause, a sigh, and then, "We just tried to survive." It wasn't always a lie, but it was never the full truth. For every woman who watched the world burn from the sidelines, there was another who passed the match: the female doctors who conducted sterilizations, the Red Cross nurses who refused to treat Jewish patients, the stenographers who typed orders for mass execution. Their fingerprints are on the Reich's final breath, just not where the spotlight shined. And yet, it's easy to forget. History, after all, prefers clear lines: good and evil, soldiers and civilians, men with guns and women in shadows. But war has never been that neat. The women of the Third Reich were not just victims or villains. They were participants, bystanders, believers, survivors, and they lived long after the war ended, their stories buried under decades of forgetting. Some died alone, clinging to Nazi medals like relics of a lost religion. Others reinvented themselves as pacifists, social workers, artists, haunted by a past they couldn't undo. And some, perhaps the most tragic of all, never believed they had done anything wrong. They simply lived the world they were handed, loved the men who wore black uniforms, cheered the flags, sang the songs, and when it all turned to ash, they swept the floor and kept singing, but only inside their heads. Today, their faces stare out from black and white photographs, frozen in time, impossible to read. Were they complicit? Were they cornered? Or were they just human, fragile, flawed, and easily fooled? These are the questions history still cannot answer. But one thing is clear: when the Third Reich fell, it wasn't just Hitler who disappeared into the darkness. It was the women who had followed Wow, willingly or not, and who were left behind in the ruins, asking questions no one wanted to answer. They didn't all die in the bunker. Not every architect of the Third Reich chose the pistol, the pill, or the cyanide capsule tucked into a hollow tooth. Some packed bags, grabbed forged documents, shaved mustaches, and vanished. When Berlin fell and the charred ruins of the Chancellery still smoked under Soviet boots, hundreds of Nazi officials, SS generals, Gestapo agents, high-ranking party loyalists slipped through the cracks. Some wore stolen uniforms. Others pretended to be civilians. But all of them were running, not just from the Allies, but from history. The myth of the clean death, that all Nazi leaders either shot themselves or stood trial, was a convenient fiction. The truth was far more disturbing. Entire networks were activated in those final days, dedicated to exfiltrating the worst of Hitler's inner circle. It was called the Rat Line, a tangled web of safe houses, fake passports, sympathetic clergy, and neutral ports. Many of its threads led south to Italy, then across the Atlantic, Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, nations that offered silence in exchange for supposed anti-communist expertise. And so, evil found new passports. Adolf Eichmann, the logistics mastermind behind the Holocaust, escaped to Buenos Aires using the name Ricardo Clement. He lived openly, raised a family, and worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory for nearly a decade before Mossad agents abducted him in 1960, drugged him, and smuggled him out in the underbelly of a commercial plane. At his trial, he claimed he was just following orders, that he'd never pulled a trigger, but the documents and the survivors told another story. He was hanged in 1962, but for every Eichmann, there were many others who were never caught. Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, who conducted grotesque medical experiments at Auschwitz, also escaped via the Rat Line. He fled to South America, lived under various aliases, and died in Brazil in 1979. reportedly from a stroke while swimming. He was never brought to justice. When investigators eventually exhumed his bones, they found nothing in the soil but silence, the kind that feels like failure. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, responsible for the torture and death of hundreds of French resistance members, also evaded justice for decades. Recruited by American intelligence for his knowledge of Soviet operations, he was shielded for years before eventually being exposed and extradited to France in the 1980s. His trial reopened old wounds and raised a terrifying question: how many monsters had been protected, not for justice, but for utility? As the Cold War deepened, the West's priorities shifted. Former Nazis, once enemies of humanity, became useful tools against communism. Scientists, spies, interrogators, all with blood on their hands, were quietly absorbed. Operation Paperclip brought dozens of Nazi scientists to the US, including Werner von Braun, who had used slave labor to build V-2 rockets and would later become a hero of the American space program. Moral lines blurred. Justice was postponed, forgotten, or worse, denied. Meanwhile, across Europe, survivors of the Reich wandered through post-war life knowing their tormentors had simply changed addresses. Some saw them on buses, in schools, in government buildings, and they said nothing, because no one wanted to listen, because justice had already been served. The Nuremberg trials, held between 1945 and 1946, had been designed as a reckoning, a public declaration that even the most powerful could be held accountable. 24 major war criminals stood in the dock. 12 were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms, but hundreds of other Nazis were never tried. Thousands more simply faded back into the shadows. By the 1950s, West Germany's own judiciary was filled with former Nazi party members. Men who had once signed off on deportations now wore robes and upheld new law. The silence became systemic. Children grew up in houses where questions were not asked, where uncles didn't talk about the war, where fathers had a mysterious gap in their employment between 1939 and 1945. The lie became inheritance, but not everyone forgot. Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor himself, dedicated their lives to tracking down fugitives. His work led to the discovery of over 1,000 former Nazis, but the process was agonizing, slow, bureaucratic, and often met with indifference. Many countries had no appetite for reopening wounds. Others quietly blocked extraditions. The fear was not just about what would be revealed, but who? Documents unearthed in later decades showed that not only were Nazis helped by foreign governments, they were sometimes actively recruited. East Germany, too, used former Nazis in their security apparatus, so long as they pledged loyalty to the new regime. And so the idea of a clean break, of a world that fully rejected the Third Reich, was itself a myth. Evil wasn't exorcised, it was filed away, and sometimes promoted. Some of the most chilling stories came not from South America, but from small towns in Bavaria or Austria, where aging Nazis lived out their days as mayors, priests, or even school teachers. In one documented case, a man who had overseen mass shootings in Poland spent the last 30 years of his life running a youth choir. When exposed, he claimed he had no memory of the past, but the ground remembered, the forests did, the graves certainly did, and in many cases the families of the murdered never stopped searching. They filed petitions, hired private investigators, followed whispers. Sometimes they found nothing. Sometimes they found graves, but rarely did they find justice. Today, the question remains: how many escaped? How many lived and died without a single consequence? Some estimates suggest over 10,000 Nazi officials fled to South America alone. Others vanished in the East, into Soviet gulags, or behind Iron Curtain intelligence agencies. A few were likely murdered by former comrades, afraid of secrets being exposed. But the truth is, we will never know. The war ended, the Reich fell, but the shadows kept walking, and as the decades passed, they blended into photo albums, pension rolls, gravestones with no footnotes. Some were never even questioned, their crimes erased by time or silence or deliberate forgetting. We want endings to be clean. We want evil to kneel, to confess, to die. But the story of the Third Reich's final breath is a story of escape, of masks, of new names whispered in warm climates, of horror transplanted, not eradicated, and of a world that, in many cases, chose not to look too closely. After all, looking meant acknowledging that the war didn't end in the rubble of Berlin. It lingered in lies, in legacy, and in the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the devil doesn't die in the dark. He moves next door. In the years that followed, the bricks were laid faster than the truth. Cities once reduced to ash rose again in perfect symmetry. New windows, new roads, new names on the doorbells. But beneath the foundation of every rebuilt German town sat a question no one dared voice aloud. Who lived here before? The war was over. The Third Reich was gone, but its fingerprints remained in the silence, in the unspoken family secrets, the locked trunks in attics, the black and white photos turned face down in drawers. Germany's post-war miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, was both an economic resurrection and an emotional escape. Factories restarted, banks reopened, children went back to school, but the past was never far away. It lingered in the cough of an old man on a park bench, in the way neighbors avoided eye contact, in the names missing from class rosters. Everyone had lost someone, but no one agreed on who was responsible, so they didn't speak of it. Entire generations grew up in houses where the word Auschwitz was never mentioned, where the war was reduced to hunger, rubble, and hard times. Guilt was privatized. Collective memory became selective. The final battle of the Third Reich wasn't waged in the ruins of Berlin. It was waged in memory, in how a nation chose to explain itself to the mirror. In West Germany, the narrative was survival, reconstruction, a new Germany. The Nuremberg trials had punished the worst, they said. The rest had simply endured. And the quicker they moved on, the more they could distance themselves from the shame. But forgetting isn't healing. It's just silence with better lighting. And that silence broke in strange places, in courtrooms, in documentaries, in classrooms where teenagers finally asked, "What did my grandfather do?" The first cracks appeared in the 1960s as student movements began demanding truth. They refused to accept the clean version of history their textbooks offered. They wanted names, details, accountability. Some marched, some shouted, some turned to violence. But all of them were asking the same thing. How do you rebuild a country without first unearthing the bones buried beneath it? East Germany took a different path. The DDR cast itself as a purely anti-fascist state, one that had defeated the Nazis and cleansed itself through socialism. It denounced the West for rehiring Nazis and presented its own version of spotless history. But the truth was murkier. East German prisons and police forces were littered with men who had worn swastikas just a decade earlier. Their loyalty had shifted, not their past. And so both halves of Germany, in their own way, sanitized history. One painted over it, the other reframed it. Meanwhile, the children of the Reich, not just the Hitler youth, but the boys and girls who grew up under the Nazi flag, were becoming parents themselves, Some broke the cycle. Others passed it on in quieter ways, a reluctance to trust outsiders, a reverence for order, an aversion to shame. Even in homes that claimed to have no politics, the war lived in the wallpaper. But truth is persistent. In the 1990s, as archives opened and survivors aged, a new wave of memory swept through Europe. Memorials began to appear, not just for battles, but for victims. Stolperstein, stumbling stones, were embedded in sidewalks outside former Jewish homes, each one bearing a name, a date, a fate. Holocaust museums expanded, school curriculums shifted, and yet, even then, debates flared. Should Germany feel shame forever? Can a nation ever be forgiven for what it did? Who gets to decide when mourning ends? These questions were not academic. They were personal. They were asked in dining rooms, at train stations, during elections. And as time passed, the lines blurred. Survivors died. Perpetrators aged. And the risk grew, not of repeating history, but of losing it. Today, visitors to Berlin can walk through glass tunnels beneath the Reichstag. They can touch the stone remnants of Hitler's bunker. They can stand in silence at Sachsenhausen or Buchenwald. But these are curated silences, moments designed for reflection, not confrontation. The real battle remains in the heart, in whether a nation's descendants are willing to carry the truth without letting it define them, whether they can say, yes, this is where we come from, and still walk forward. And it's not just Germany. The world, too, has played its part in forgetting. The nations that turned away refugees, the companies that profited from war, the leaders who shook hands with tyrants, the allies who bombed cities flat, then claimed moral purity. No one emerged clean. And perhaps that's the most honest legacy of the Third Reich, the realization that evil doesn't arrive wearing horns. It arrives in policy, in slogans, in uniforms designed by good tailors. It hides in bureaucracy, in apathy, in fear, and when it collapses, the silence it leaves behind can be just as dangerous as the violence, because silence, too, is a teacher. It teaches denial. It teaches revision. It teaches generations that some things are better left unsaid, but the ruins still whisper, the stones still remember, the ghosts, and there are many, still walk. The last battle of the Third Reich was not fought in 1945. It was not fought with tanks or in bunkers or in alleyways lit by the flash of Soviet shells. It was, and is, fought in books, in museums, in the quiet questions asked by grandchildren holding yellowed photographs. Who were you? What did you do? What did you believe? The answers are not always satisfying, but the asking matters, because memory is a battlefield, and the truth, however painful, is the only weapon strong enough to keep the Reich buried. What does it mean to survive a war, not just as a soldier, but as a nation, as a generation? What happens when the bullets stop, but the guilt doesn't? For millions around the world, World War II ended not with peace, but with a silence so heavy it became generational. In Germany, the children of the Reich inherited not medals or flags, but absence. Missing fathers, ashamed mothers, neighbors who wouldn't say where they were in 1943, and a country desperate to move forward without looking back. In America, the victors returned home to parades and prosperity, but many brought with them things they couldn't name: nightmares, rage, a sense that the things they'd seen in camps, in villages, in blood-soaked fields would follow them home like ghosts that didn't need passports. In Japan, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lived in shadows, stigmatized by radiation and wrapped in national shame. In the Soviet Union, soldiers were warned not to speak of what they'd seen in Berlin. The official story was one of triumph, but inside their heads, many carried memories of starving children, of mass graves, of things that had no place in a victory parade. The war was over, but no one knew what to do with the weight it left behind. And across Europe, in places like France, Poland, Austria, the war settled in like dust. Invisible, but everywhere. It was in the buildings that were never rebuilt, the fields that still hid bones, the train tracks that no one walked near. It was in the songs people no longer sang, the names they didn't give their children, the questions they never asked their parents. Every country dealt with its trauma differently. Some built monuments, some tore down statues, some changed their school books. Others just let time do the forgetting. But time doesn't heal what isn't acknowledged. And so the war bled forward, not in battlefields, but in minds, in behaviors, in stories half told. One of the quietest tragedies of the post-war era was how many survivors were silenced. Women who had been raped during the fall of Berlin were told to be grateful they lived. Prisoners of war were told not to dwell on their suffering. Jewish survivors of camps were often met with disbelief, or worse, indifference. And children born to Nazi officers or collaborationist mothers were left in a kind of historical orphanage, blamed for origins they never chose. In places like Norway and France, these war children faced bullying, isolation, and even institutionalization because their very existence reminded people of choices they wished had never happened. It wasn't just Germany that had to confront its past. It was the world. America had to grapple with the fact that it turned away Jewish refugees before the war. Britain had to remember its own empire's dark corners. France had to reckon with how many of its own collaborated with the Nazis. The Netherlands had to face the reality that Anne Frank wasn't betrayed by an invader, but likely by a neighbor. No one came out of the war untouched. And yet, for decades, the dominant narrative remained binary: heroes and villains, good versus evil. The Allies defeated the Nazis, and the world was saved. But history is never that clean, and for every banner waved in celebration, there were 10 stories buried in silence. The pain of those years didn't end with treaties. It mutated, hardened, passed down. Some families never spoke of it again. Others made it their identity. And in both cases, the wound remained. Even today, echoes of that silence shape us. In Germany, Holocaust education is mandatory, and denial is a crime, yet far-right movements still march. In Russia, the victory over Nazism is celebrated every May 9th with grandeur, but the more nuanced truths are often suppressed. In America, World War II is still remembered as the Good War, but that memory sometimes hides the darker chapters: the internment camps, the segregation, the firebombing of cities like Dresden and Tokyo. In Japan, the trauma of Hiroshima and Nagasaki runs so deep that some families never speak of it, even now. And in former Axis nations, there's a lingering question: how do you remember your dead when your cause was wrong? There are no easy answers. But the worst answer is silence, because silence is where myths grow, where revisionism festers, where the past gets reshaped into propaganda. That's why the battle of memory, the battle that came after the tank stopped, is still being fought, not with weapons, but with textbooks, with documentaries, with survivors brave enough to tell the truth, even when it hurts, with museums that show the shoes, the glasses, the hair, not as relics but as evidence, proof that the war was real, that it happened, that it wasn't just numbers or strategies or maps, but human lives shattered by ideology. And this is why the last battle of the Third Reich is still being fought, not in Berlin, but in every place where someone asks, did this really happen? In every classroom where a teacher decides whether or not to show the photos, In every home where a family decides whether to open the letters, the medals, the journals, in every country deciding what parts of its past it's willing to confront, and which parts it wants to bury. Memory is not passive. It is not neutral. It is a battlefield. And like all battlefields, it demands courage. The courage to look, to ask, to listen, to say, this was who we were, and now we must choose who we will be. The Third Reich fell in rubble, its banners burned, its leaders died or ran, but the true end of its power wasn't written in blood, it was written in memory, in what we choose to remember and what we're too afraid to face. History isn't just a story of what happened, it's a mirror, and sometimes the most terrifying thing it reflects is us. If this story moved you, made you think, or made you question what else history has buried, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the past doesn't stay in the past, not unless we make sure it does.